Good evening, gentlemen, and once again, happy St. Patrick's Day. It may be a new lecture for you, but I'm recording a whole mess of these at once, so it's still St. Patrick's Day for me, and I say again, happy St. Patrick's Day. I am surrounded this evening by the wisdom of years past, various books and things that people have had to say on a whole multitude of subjects. Right behind me is our dear friend Aristotle and a bust of him, which is an especially appropriate thing for this evening, as we're going to be discussing the notion of love. And Aristotle had a great deal to say about the nature of love. What does it mean to love? How do we love rightly? How do we love wrongly? One of the things that we saw last unit was that there are good and bad ways of seeking the good. Likewise, what we're going to see is there are good and bad ways of loving. And so as we talk about the vocation to marriage and the vocation to family life, at the root of which really is love, what we need to figure out is, what are good ways of loving? What are bad ways of loving? Because ultimately, the purpose of every single Christian vocation is to teach us how to love rightly and how to love better. As a little bit of a reference, most of what I have to say for this evening's lecture is taken from C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves. You can find it pretty easily in the library and many other places, in addition to which there are doodle videos of each of the chapters. I'm going to include in the link below, in the description below, a link to C.S. Lewis's doodle on Eros, on that romantic love. For the moment, though, we're going to be talking about all four loves, what all of the loves have in common, and then we're going to start with breaking each of them down with a special and final focus on Eros as we begin our transition to talk more deeply about family life. As we begin any conversation, as we begin any discussion, one of the things that I've constantly mentioned to you all is that we have two questions we should always be answering any time that we make an assertion. What do you mean, and how do you know? As we talk about the four loves then, the first thing that we need to do is ask, what do we mean when we talk about love? Aristotle defines love as to will the good of the other. When I say I love you, what I mean fundamentally is I want your good. I delight in that which is good about you. I want to continue for you to have all of the good things that you have in this life. Remember what we said last unit, is that Aristotle is going to say the good is that which all things seek. When I seek my own good, when I seek the continuation of my own existence, I am desiring good for myself. What love says is we're taking that desire, which is originally turned towards ourselves, and we are then rotating it outwards. We are then saying, this feeling that I have for myself, this desire that I have for my own self, is now going to be about others. And in that sense also, love is also described as a unitive force. And in this regard, it's absolutely true. When I say that I love another person, what I fundamentally mean is, I want what is good for that person just as surely as though it were to benefit me. Except that when I love another person, it's completely altruistic. When I delight in something that happens to my friend, I rejoice because it is something good that happens to my friend, not necessarily because I am going to benefit. It is all about that person. But I rejoice just as surely as that good were to have happened to me. Their good becomes my good. And as if they declare themselves my friend, my good becomes their good. And in this regard, to love is to will the good of the other, and at the same time, love is fundamentally also a unitive force. There are four kinds of good. Greek was very wise in this regard. In English, we really only have one word. We have love. I love you, you love me, he loves her, she loves money, everybody loves something else. All of these things, when I say I love hot dogs and somebody else says I love my wife, we have no real way of distinguishing those things. Greek, however, thankfully, has a bit more precision. And so there are four distinct kinds of love that the Greeks have in mind. The first is Storge. Storge is a family love. It's sometimes also called, C.S. Lewis refers to it in his book, The Four Loves, as the love of affection. It's the affection that I feel towards my grandparents and towards my parents, and the affection that they feel towards me. one of the key things that we're going to see in the next slide is that Storge is fundamentally an unchosen love. Any time that you have an affection for somebody else that results from conditions you didn't entirely control, that's Storge. That's that love of affection. That's that familial love. In addition to this is Philia. Philia is the love that exists between friends. Philia was so often lauded by the ancients. Cicero wrote an entire book, De Amicitia, on friendship. Aristotle made friendship a key part of his Nicomachean Ethics. Unfortunately, as we have only one word for love, friendship, sadly, does seem to get pretty well lost in the mix. And when we think about the crisis of loneliness that exists in our current society, this is not a theoretical notion. This becomes very, very important. The fact that we have really starved ourselves of what the ancients considered one of the highest and purest forms of love is very much has a bearing on modern society and possibly even some of the issues with modern society. Eros, romantic love. This is the one that in our slides we're going to be focusing on last, but in most traditional lists comes third. Eros is romantic love. And one of the things that we're going to see later on is that Eros is often linked with sexual attraction, but it really is a very distinct reality. And C.S. Lewis has much to say on that, and we'll be getting to that shortly. Ultimately, the highest love is called Agape. It is gift love, the love where I purely and simply give myself to another person. This is the love ultimately that God has for each and every one of us. And in fact, in the New Testament, anytime God's love is described, the word in Greek that is used is the word agape. Not eros, not storge, not philia, agape. The sort of love that God has for all of us, that is agape. And the more and more that we learn agape love, the more and more it can really be said that we are being perfect, just as our Father in heaven is perfect. A major theme that we discussed last time around. So let's turn now to, with a little more detail, to each of the four kinds of love. Storge, as I mentioned, is unchosen bonds of family and community. And this can look like a number of different things. It can look like the love that a father has for a son, or a son for his father. Storge is fundamentally family love. Whenever we talk about Storge, family is the touchstone. Family is the reference. Other things can begin to resemble Storge, or other things can be forms of Storge. At its heart, Storge is family love. Community being really just a larger form of family. Another way that Storge can often manifest itself is the love and the affection that individuals who are struggling together with common cause develop. The love of two individuals who have shared a foxhole. Below we see here an image from the miniseries Band of Brothers. And the fact that this is the title of that miniseries, and the fact that they took this concept from Henry V. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile. Henry was convinced that to share in the discomforts and to share in the risks of the Battle of Agincourt would make him a king, brother with all of these peasants. In the medieval mindset, this was absolutely unthinkable. But here Henry is saying, if you shed your blood with me, we have Storge. We have that brotherly love. I will love you like a brother. You will love me like a brother. This is an unchosen bond because ultimately, when men go to war, it is often, very, very often, not a war of their choosing. Really, Henry was the only one, for instance, who made the choice for England to go to war with France. Nobody else was making that choice, but they all heeded the call when Henry asked them, please join me in my struggle. Likewise, World War II. The soldiers in the 101st Airborne didn't decide one day, hey, wouldn't it be great if Japan attacked us and we responded? Wouldn't it be great if Germany then declared war and we responded? No. A war was declared, their country needed them. They were thrown together in circumstances they could not really imagine. And to a certain extent as well, anytime you have communities that are struggling together and striving together, you have an example of Storge. And this makes sense when you consider how both Plato and Aristotle conceived of the city as really an outgrowth of families. Aristotle and Plato are both going to say cities came about because families were insufficient, because families couldn't provide for their own needs. And so eventually the McClanahans and the McDonoughs and the McHughes and the McLarens, they all get together and they form this one big family. And all of a sudden, this larger family we're going to call a city, a town. This is the origin of cities. And so Storge, that love that we initially associate with families, also then becomes a love that is affiliated, that is associated with cities. Interestingly enough, I think we can see in the current crisis with Corona, both the strengths and weaknesses of our own society and what Storge can really provide in a society. When we have seen people selflessly saying, yes, I am going to quarantine myself, we see Storge, we see people recognizing there are unchosen bonds of community. I did not choose to live in this city. I did not choose to live with other people. I did not choose to live with individuals who are immunocompromised. And yet, we do in fact live in this community. We are in fact all in this together. And it's really been a beautiful thing. Conversely, I think we can say that for all of the resistance that we've seen, and we have to be honest, there has been a lot of resistance. People saying, why should I curtail my plans just because that group over there, which is totally near death anyway, why should I have to give up my plans for the sake of them? And the answer is Storge. That's Storge, that form of love which these individuals so clearly lack. And as we see our nation struggling to respond appropriately to this virus and people failing to make the appropriate sacrifices to help the most vulnerable, to help those who are most at risk from this virus, we do see the difference that Storge makes, and we see the tragic results when we lack Storge. It really is important that we keep all four of these loves in mind, and we forget these four loves. We forget that there's more to life than just romantic love, at our own risk, at our own peril. The next form of love is Philia, the love of friendship. Aristotle is going to say that there are three types of friendship. You have friendships of utility and friendships of pleasure. A friendship of utility, basically, this is, I respect you, I like you, but ultimately, we are associating with one another because you are useful to me. Business transactions. Business transactions are perfect examples of friendships of utility. People who are workplace colleagues, workplace friends. Now, this isn't to say that a friendship of utility can't grow into something more. I think most of us have had experiences of perhaps you start off as liking somebody in your class, but then you have become very good friends over these past few years. Many of the teachers here at Jesuit can likewise say, maybe I started out as a workplace colleague with somebody else here on the faculty, but over years of working together and sharing stories and sweating together, we really did develop a genuine, deeper level of friendship. Friendship of utility isn't a bad form of friendship, but it is a basic form of friendship, and it's what Aristotle would consider as the lowest form of friendship. Very businesslike and very fragile. As soon as the business relationship is over, it's going to end unless it goes somewhere deeper. There's friendships of pleasure. These are usually very intensely emotional friendships. There might be some shared interests, like maybe we both really love dance, or we both really love Star Wars, or we both really love football. And so our friendship is going to be based purely on those common interests. But just as the friendship of utility, a friendship of pleasure is going to end as soon as the source of pleasure ends. Think of all of the people whose friendships, for instance, only revolved around sports. Right now, if that, with the sports events all canceled, those friendships are, at the very least, the pause button has been pushed. They won't end forever, but those friends, that Philia, hasn't really graduated to anything deeper. And so the friends that are solely a friendship based on pleasure, right now, that's not really a source of love. That's not really a source of Philia for these individuals. The highest form of friendship, Aristotle is going to say, is a friendship of good, where two individuals share a conception of the good. Basically, it's two people who are able to stand shoulder to shoulder with one another, look out at the world and see things in precisely the same way. I have here an image of St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Francis Xavier. This was a beautiful example of a friendship based on the good. Here we have St. Ignatius as he's preparing to send Francis Xavier off to India. One friend sending another off to missionary work, and they will never see one another again. They will never know the pleasure of walking through the streets of Rome together again. They will never have the utility of working together as leader of the Jesuits and close secretary. Xavier was also Ignatius's secretary in the early days of the Jesuits. They will no longer have the utility and they will no longer have the pleasure. But they have a much deeper friendship than that. Their friendship is based on a common way of looking at the world. Xavier and Ignatius truly had a friendship based on the good. So that at one point, Xavier is even going to write to Ignatius a letter where he says, I took the signature from your last letter and I sewed it into my cassock so that a part of you might always be near my heart. These were two men who had a very dear and passionate love for one another, men who were womanizers before they entered the Jesuits, before they founded the Jesuits. And together they had a very strong, very intense friendship. This was the kind of friendship that someone like Aristotle, that someone like Plato or Cicero is going to be praising nonstop. And when Aristotle says friendship is necessary to grow in virtue, this sort of friendship, a friendship of philia, a philia based on the good, that is what Aristotle is talking about when he talks about this great love of friendship. And when we think of how people are so lonely today, we see what happens again in society when we don't really have any sort of philia, or when we think that marriage is the only cure to loneliness, which several Supreme Court decisions, including one that allowed gay marriage, Justice Kennedy specifically said that marriage is a cure to loneliness, in a sense. But if we have a conception of philia, where two individuals, without any particular sexual or romantic attraction, two individuals can come together with a shared conception of the good, stand shoulder to shoulder with one another and say, we see things in the same way. That is a truly beautiful thing. And in that moment, loneliness is truly shattered and community is formed. The next sort of love is agape. This is the highest form of love. And as I'd mentioned before, any time that the New Testament associates love with God, the word in Greek, as you can see here, is agape. In 1 John 4:16, for instance, John writes, "Ha theos agape estin." God is love. Agape being the word for love, estin being is, theos referring to God. The love that God has is fundamentally an agape love. Agape love is gift love. The love that says, everything I have is yours. And we can find this expressed in a number of ways. We can find this expressed in Christian charity for other individuals. We see here, for instance, an image of St. Aloysius Gonzaga caring for plague victims. St. Aloysius, incidentally, gave himself over so fully to the plague victims, he himself was stricken with plague and he himself died of plague. Aloysius is considered now the patron saint of plague victims and of people who tend to plague victims. If you want to pray St. Aloysius Gonzaga, one of the three Jesuit boy saints, because he died before he ever was ordained, St. Aloysius Gonzaga is an excellent individual to pray to. Agape is also seen as we give ourselves in love over to God, as we see now St. John Paul II, St. John Paul the Great, giving himself over to God as he prays the rosary. Agape, interestingly enough, in Latin is also translated caritas. Deus caritas est is how God is love is translated in Latin. Caritas, or charity, is sometimes also referred to as love rightly ordered, because there is a recognition that love can be good and love can be bad. And so we have to have that agape. We have to have that giving love that properly orders and properly organizes all of the other forms of love. And this is one of the reasons why agape is fundamentally considered the highest form of love. The last form of love we're going to be talking about today is Eros. Now, one of the other links I'm going to include down in the description below is a link to the Super Bowl commercial that described the four loves. And it did accurately describe, to a reasonable extent, the love of Storge, that love of Philia, that love of Agape. My one complaint about that video was that it incorrectly described Eros. All of the other three kinds of love, it describes as something that we choose. Eros, however, was pretty exclusively described, number one, as something that is unchosen, which is not correct. Aristotle is going to say that love is always an act of the will. When I love, I voluntarily say, I want to keep on loving you. I want to keep making sure that good occurs for you. And this can occur in romance as well. And the other issue that I have is that the video basically indicated that Eros is equated solely with sexual attraction. And that's one of the first things we need to remember. Eros is not equal to sexual attraction, although the two can coincide. C.S. Lewis had made an excellent point in his book, The Four Loves. When we talk about sexual attraction, we talk about desires, we talk about perhaps an itch that I would like to scratch, or an enjoyment of physical pleasure, as an individual might enjoy a fine glass of wine, or a cigarette. He's speaking in very 1940s terms. But C.S. Lewis says the difference between sexual attraction and Eros, between desire and Eros. When I finish my cigarette, I stamp out the butt, I throw away the carton. When I finish the glass of wine, I put the glass aside. I put the bottle aside. I don't use it anymore. I stop thinking about the wine, unless I have a particular dependency, alcoholism, and this becomes a problem. Eros, however, if it's true Eros, and not just sexual attraction, what Lewis observes is, if an individual has Eros for another individual, if a man has Eros for his wife, after he's made love to her, he doesn't discard her like he does a used cigarette butt. He doesn't put her aside as he does the empty bottle of wine. He continues to think about her. He continues to love her. The itch, as it were, may have been scratched, but he still has that Eros. He still has that romantic love. And so for that reason, because we can distinguish mere desire, which scratching the itch, that'll satisfy the mere desire, versus Eros, something that keeps on going time and time again in sickness and health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse. The two things are clearly distinct. Eros is clearly different from sexual attraction. And C.S. Lewis points out that in the best of cases, Eros ultimately leads to sexual attraction. Fundamentally, what we have with Eros is a delight in contemplating the other. Lewis says, when you ask a man who is stricken with Eros, when you ask a man who is truly in love, what he is thinking about, he says, the beloved. Someone who has Eros delights in everything about it. And C.S. Lewis says, the man is a contemplative. A husband is a contemplative for his wife. A wife is a contemplative for her husband. In just the same way that we would expect a monk or a nun to be a contemplative and constantly be thinking about God, so we would say Eros is that desire that allows a man or a woman to be constantly contemplating and delighting in that other individual. And now you may have been picking up on a word that I've been using. As we talk about Eros, we talk about delight. And so we have a recognition of beauty, that this person is truly beautiful, that there is an integrity, there is a harmony. And so just as C.S. Lewis observes with the beauty of nature, we see this beauty and that beauty beckons to us and we say, I want to be a part of this. That is what Eros does. A man sees a woman and says, you are beautiful. You have that integrity, you have that harmony, you have that splendor. Everything about you, I want to be a part of. And the woman likewise says to the man, everything about you, I want to be a part of. And in this regard as well, we can see how Eros sets the stage for a good and holy marriage, where, as Jesus tells us, the two become one flesh. The lover and the beloved do indeed, in contemplating each other's beauty, they do in fact succeed in becoming one. With Romeo and Juliet, Romeo says, it is the east and Juliet is the sun. That attitude is a perfect example of Eros. Romeo is a contemplative for Juliet. Juliet is Romeo's everything. Romeo never wants to stop thinking about Juliet. It is all Juliet all the time. That is Romeo's focus. So that line, it is the east and Juliet is the sun, a perfect and wonderful and beautiful example of Eros and how Romeo and Juliet did truly, if somewhat stupidly, because they were about 14 or so, come together. And yet, it is such a shining example of Eros. And it's not for nothing that Romeo and Juliet, for all of their flaws, their story has become basically synonymous with a great love story. Ultimately, Eros is about a full appreciation of the goodness of the other. When Romeo loves his Juliet, he loves everything about her. He loves her hair, he loves her humor, he loves the way that she looks at the world. This is the person Romeo is contemplating. Lewis says all of the details, all of the fine print can go away. Juliet even says, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Why might your name be Romeo? Juliet even wishes that Romeo's family name be cast away because that interferes with their love. It is a full appreciation of the goodness of the other. And this is something important to recognize as well, with Eros being a full recognition of the goodness of the other, a full appreciation. It is often said that one of the issues with pornography is not that it shows too much of a woman, but that it shows too little. And we can say as well, pornography involving men. It shows too much? No, it shows too little. Because really, it just shows us that physical element. Eros is about so much more than that, which is why I really do have to complain about that one issue in the Super Bowl commercial where Eros was just reduced to sexual attraction. Eros goes beyond that. And we can also think then, if pornography trains us to see too little in an individual, then pornography really has starved us. Or pornography and other issues around that, it has trained us to see love as something that is too narrow, too restrictive. And so we tend to be very reductive. We only see love in terms of Eros, and we only see Eros in terms of sexual attraction. One of the things that I hope you've been able to appreciate as we go through these 4 different kinds of love is, first of all, love is a much vaster concept than we're usually used to talking about. And that, second of all, Eros itself is a much broader thing. And this goes also to one of the things that we were noting in the difference between ordered versus disordered goods. Ordered goods takes in the whole vision. A disordered good focuses really just narrowly, only in one area. We can see now, really in a very concrete sort of way, how a too narrow vision of love, a too narrow vision of the good, can really impoverish an individual, can really impoverish a society. So these are the 4 loves. Remember, Storge, Philia, Agape, Eros. Normally, Agape and Eros are switched. We're finishing on Eros because it's going to make for a smoother transition to talking about romantic love and talking about the issues with romantic love. But Storge, Philia, Eros, and Agape. These are the 4 types of love noted by C.S. Lewis, Aristotle, and so many others. So there you have the 4 loves. What we're going to talk about in the next section, in our next lecture, is some of the problems with love and some of the issues with wayward love and how we can correct that a little bit. For now, though, keep on contemplating, keep on considering love, keep on expanding and growing ever more widely your notions of who you should be loving, those bonds of love. Love widely, love vastly. Have a good evening. Once again, happy St. Patrick's Day. And remember your unchosen bonds. Keep other people healthy and stay safe right now.